It was a Thursday night, October 30th, 1969. The Barrowland Ballroom had emptied, the over-25s night winding down, the lights dimmed, the sound of shoes on the floor still in people's heads. Helen Puttock and her sister Jean climbed into a taxi with a man who called himself John. He was smartly dressed, polite, spoke about the Bible and about how married women shouldn't be out dancing. He said, and I quote as Jean later remembered him, that an adulterous wife is stoned to death. They drove, and Jean got out at her home. She watched him stay with Helen for a brief moment at the corner of a close. Then, that was the last time anyone saw Helen alive.
It's chilling, Laura. The taxi ride is the central spine of the whole story, the one consistent, detailed witness account that the entire investigation built around.
Yeah, Jean Langford, Jeannie, she is in many ways the keystone witness. The image she helped form, a polite, well-spoken man in his 20s or early 30s, suit and tie, teetotal or almost teetotal, quoting scripture, that became the public face of Bible John. But Ewan, that also leaves us with a huge fragility, one woman's memory hanging over 3 murders.
Exactly. We have to treat Jean's testimony with enormous respect. She was present and traumatised, and also with forensic caution. Memory is malleable, especially after repeated interviews, media exposure and time. The police and public built an identity from her recollection, and that identity shaped every subsequent lead.
Before we dive into Jean in the taxi, let's set the scene a bit. Glasgow in the late 1960s, still an industrial city, shipyards and heavy industry in retreat, pockets of poverty, but a thriving music and dance culture. The Barrowland Ballroom sat above the Barras Market, a place people loved and where people met. Over 25s nights were hugely popular. The 3 women who would be killed, Patricia Docker, Jemima McDonald and Helen Puttock, all attended those nights. That link turned a local dance floor into a hunting ground in people's imagination.
And policing was very different then. No CCTV, no DNA, no automated databases. Investigations relied on witness statements, painstaking door-to-door inquiries and composite sketches. That matters because a crucial early misstep, the failure to connect Patricia Docker to the Barrowland right away, may have cost investigators valuable time. By the time they saw the pattern, memories had already faded.
Right. It's worth saying the nickname Bible John wasn't coined by police. The press gave it that name after Jean recounted the biblical remarks during the taxi ride. The nickname carried a moral weight. He became not just a murderer, but a religious moraliser in the public imagination. That framing had a sting. It fed an appetite to judge the victim's behaviour as much as to find their killer.
You see the double bind. On one hand, a ritualistic, religiously framed killer. On the other, a media narrative that implicitly moralised the women for going out dancing. Both shaped public perception and arguably how the investigation unfolded.
Let's go back in order to the first victim, Patricia Pat Docker. Pat was around 25, a nurse, mother of a young son, living back with her parents in Langside after separating from her husband. On the evening of February 22nd, 1968, she told her parents she was heading to the Majestic Ballroom, but evidence later suggested she spent her night at the Barrowland. The exact stay-in at the wrong venue, that confusion, is one of the earliest and most painful what-ifs in the case.
Police initially treated Pat's death as an isolated sex murder. Her clothes and handbag were missing when her body was found in a lane behind Carmichael Place early on February 23rd. She'd been strangled and badly assaulted, beaten and kicked, according to the post-mortem by Professor Gilbert Forbes, and she was menstruating. Those details would later be seen as a repeating pattern.
Her estranged husband, Alex Docker, was an early suspect.
He was in the RAF, stationed abroad for much of their marriage, and there were strains in their relationship. He was investigated but not charged. And crucially, at that early stage, the police didn't link her to the Barrowland. If they had, maybe the series would have been interrupted.
We have to be careful about counterfactuals. Police were working with the information they had. But yes, that delay in pattern recognition is significant. The killer, if the same man, had at least another year before the next confirmed attack.
Which brings us to the second victim, Jemima McDonald. Jemima was 31, a mother of 3 from Bridgeton. On the night of August 16th, 1969, she went to the Barrowland and left with a man witnesses described as well-dressed, polite, slim, 25 to 35 years old. Different witnesses gave variations on his hair colour, fair, ginger or brown with fair streaks, but many remembered him as articulate and respectable. Around 12:30 a.m, she leaves the venue with this man and is later found in a derelict flat near her home, beaten and strangled, her handbag gone, menstruating. The similarities begin to pile up.
After Jemima's murder, investigators began publicly linking the cases. They produced a hand-drawn composite and, for the first time in Scotland, released an image of a murder suspect to the public. Undercover officers began patrolling the Barrowland and other dance venues, but nothing conclusive came from that intrusive surveillance. And that composite, later refined into a photo fit, became the face people associated with Bible John for decades.
Photo fit in June 1970 gave us the sharper image. Medium build, slightly prominent front teeth, short reddish fair hair, sharp features. That photo fit lodged in the nation's memory. People in Glasgow today still sometimes use "he looked like the Bible John photo fit" as a shorthand. But even with that widely circulated image, thousands were interviewed, hundreds paraded, and Jean, the sister in the taxi case, attended more than 300 identity parades and identified no one. It's a haunting detail.
And then Helen's murder, the third, pushed everything into a formal serial killer investigation. Helen was 29, lived in Scottstown, mother with young children, and her sister Jean was with her that night. They met 2 men at the Barrowland who both called themselves John. One left, the one who stayed in the taxi with Helen, the one who preached about adulterous wives and prayer at Hogmanay, is the man Jean would always describe. His behaviour was outwardly respectable, he claimed to be teetotal, and he was unusually moralising for a man at a dance hall.
During that cab ride, Jean later said he was talkative. He claimed to be an only child, then contradicted himself, mentioning a sister. He told stories about fosters and strict religious upbringing. He tapped his nose and said, "You know what happens to nosy folk," when Jean asked to see his ID. He showed an ID card to Helen but refused to let Jean see it. Little theatrical gestures that made the night feel strange to an observer.
Those gestures matter psychologically. The display, then withdrawal of an ID, the performative religiosity, the moralising about married women, they all suggest a man who wants to appear socially superior, perhaps to mask violent insecurity. We see these elements in other offenders who present a public respectability while harbouring a darker private life.
When Helen's body was found the next morning in her own back garden, beaten in the face, raped, strangled with her own stocking, with a bite mark on her wrist and sanitary products positioned under her left armpit, the scale of depravity was undeniable. It was also the clearest forensic moment. Semen preserved on Helen's tights, a bite mark that could be compared, grass stains indicating a struggle. That preserved semen would become crucial decades later.
But remember, it was still the pre-DNA era. Forensics then relied on blood grouping, semen typing, hair and fibre analysis. Crime scene management wasn't as strict as it is now, so while samples were preserved, and that's fortunate, the room for contamination and degradation was real. many cases.
Let's pause for a second. Jean's testimony gave the man his moniker, Bible John, and the media ran with it. The nickname painted him as a religious moraliser and made the whole case about sin and punishment as much as it was ever about a murderer. That had consequences for how the victims were talked about, sometimes blamed for going out dancing, and that kind of victim blaming sits very poorly in retrospective examinations.
Absolutely. It's important to emphasise that the public discourse at the time framed working-class women's nightlife as a moral failing, which influenced how stories were told and what leads received attention. Policing is a product of its time, and the investigators, almost all men, had cultural blind spots about sexual violence and women's autonomy.
I want to walk listeners through the scale of the investigation now. After Helen's murder, the police mobilised a massive manhunt. Over 100 detectives worked full-time. Some 50,000 witness statements were taken in the first year. More than 5,000 men were questioned. Hundreds took part in identity parades. Jean alone attended over 300 line-up identifications and never identified a suspect. It's a portrait of intensity and yet of frustration.
And that frustration grew into a long list of named suspects. Some were plausible, some intriguing, some later excluded. We should go through the main names, the what-ifs that have haunted cold case detectives and true crime readers for decades. John Edgar, John White, as reported by retired detective Les Brown. John Irvine McInnes, exhumed in 1996 to obtain DNA, and the high-profile Peter Tobin, who attracted intense public speculation but was DNA cleared. Each carries its own complications.
Let's start with the Edgar White story, because it's one of those frustrating near misses. Les Brown, a junior detective on the case, later claimed he'd identified a man at the Barrowland who resembled the composite. Brown said the man first gave a false name, then later identified himself as John Edgar from the Gorbals. Convinced, but the man lacked the overlapping front teeth that Jean had described, so he was discounted. Ewan, is that the kind of thing that can derail an investigation?
It can. Investigators often place significant weight on a few discriminating features from a witness: a distinctive scar, an unusual set of teeth, a limp. But human memory for something like teeth can be surprisingly unreliable under stress. If a suspect looks right in most ways but differs on one detail, it can lead to missed opportunities. Of course, Detective Brown's claims surfaced years later, which complicates our view. Memories of police officers can be as fallible as everyone else's.
Then there's John Irvine McInnes. In 1996, his body was exhumed because he had been suspected and died by suicide in 1980. McInnes had served in the Scots Guards and was related to a senior police officer. He fit parts of the description, and there were internal rumours about him, so the police sought DNA to compare with the semen preserved from Helen's case. But the result was inconclusive, not a definitive match, but not a clear exclusion. The then Lord Advocate said there wasn't enough to link him to the murders. Jean Langford also never identified McInnes as the man in the taxi. So we had a suspect, a test, and no closure.
It's a real example of the limits of retesting decades later. Degraded DNA, mixed samples or contamination can prevent a decisive answer. An inconclusive result leaves families and investigators in limbo. And the fact he was related to a senior officer stirred suspicion about potential conflicts of interest, whether justified or not. The mere suggestion of internal protection feeds conspiracy narratives.
And then Tobin, Peter Tobin, who later became a convicted serial killer, loomed large in public debates. He had been in Glasgow in 1968 and frequented the Barrowland. Some writers, like Professor David Wilson, argued Tobin's later crimes suggested earlier offending. He had documented violent reactions to menstruation in his known crimes. But the timeline was problematic. Tobin married in August 1969 and was in Brighton around that time. Operation Anagram, the review of his life, tested his DNA against the semen from Helen's clothing. The semen did not match Tobin. He was formally ruled out. Also, he had a distinctive scar under his left eye that wasn't reported by witnesses, and Jean said he wasn't the man. He attracted attention because he was already a revealed monster, but the science didn't back it.
Tobin is instructive because it shows how public appetite for closure can reach for the nearest known evil. A violent, later convicted killer who was in the same city becomes an easy candidate. But good investigative practice requires timeline checks, corroboration and forensic confirmation, which Tobin lacked. It's a caution against assigning cold cases to more recent criminals simply because they fit a general pattern.
There are other theories that surface from time to time. Some detectives in the 1980s wondered whether Patricia Docker might have been killed by someone close to her, a domestic homicide, and that maybe the other two murders were the work of a separate stranger. Statistically, women are more likely to be killed by partners than strangers, and that logic pushes us to consider simpler domestic explanations. But the repetition of menstrual detail, handbag thefts, and the Barrowland link argues strongly for a single offender, a signature pattern that connects the three. It's messy.
And then there is the cop theory, the idea that Bible John could have been a police officer. Some authors speculated about it because the man in the taxi showed an ID and seemed to know bus and train routes, possibly had easy knowledge of local police procedure. But there's no public forensic or documentary proof for that claim. It remains speculative. The danger of that theory is that it erodes public trust in institutions without producing hard evidence.
At the heart of it is motive and offender profile. From the patterns we can fairly say the killer appeared to target women who were out dancing, often married, often mothers, usually brunettes in their mid-20s to early 30s. He approached them at the Barrowland, presented as respectable, possibly religious, won trust, then attacked them in liminal spaces close to their homes. He used stockings or hands to strangle them, sexually assaulted them, removed their handbags, and, in Helen's case explicitly, arranged sanitary items in a disturbing manner. That menstrual focus is one of the most talked about elements of the case.
Yes, the menstrual detail suggests a sexual disgust or rage, specifically centred on female sexuality and bodily functions. Combine that with biblical invective against adulterous wives, and you have someone whose internal moral code is punitive. He may be punishing women for perceived sexual transgressions. The signature elements, the tidiness of leaving bodies close to home, the taking of handbags, could also indicate trophy behaviour or efforts to confuse timing and identity. From a profiler's perspective, he was likely male, mid to late 20s or early 30s at the time, articulate, locally knowledgeable, and able to blend into dance hall crowds.
We should also talk about the media role, how names stick. Bible John is a press invention that, while useful in mobilising public attention, also reduced 3 lives into a lurid label. Papers ran with headlines about religious killer and Barrowland den of iniquity. And sadly, some coverage implicitly blamed the women for going out late or being married and dancing. That moral framing is a product of its era, the late 1960s, but it shaped public memory for decades. It made the story into folklore.
Public memory is powerful. The Barrowland itself became a haunted place in the local imagination. It survived and later reinvented itself as a famous rock venue, but the shadow of Bible John clung to it. The media's retellings, TV documentaries and books reinforced the photo fit and the nickname, embedding them in cultural memory, even when the facts were ambiguous.
Moving forward in time, modern forensic techniques offered new hope. Semen from Helen's tights was preserved, and by the 1990s, DNA testing was possible.
McInnes was exhumed in 1996 to try to get a match. Inconclusive. Operation Anagram tested Peter Tobin. No match. Around 2004, detectives said they'd found an 80% genetic match between the Bible John semen profile and DNA from a minor crime 2 years earlier, suggesting a familial link, perhaps a nephew or cousin, and invited a group of men to submit samples. There was no public conclusion announced. So technology opened a door, but didn't deliver the closure people hoped for.
Familial DNA leads are a double-edged sword. They can point investigators toward relatives of an unknown donor, but they also raise privacy and ethical concerns. And unless there's a clear, provable match to a named suspect, these leads tie investigators into long, complex searches. The death of Jean Langford in 2010 removed the one living person with that deep, detailed memory of the man. With her gone, the case lost a critical human memory resource.
There are so many still unanswered questions. What if the police had linked Patricia to the Barrowland immediately? Would Jemima and Helen be alive? How reliable is Jean's memory after decades of questioning and making identifications? Is the menstruation pattern a genuine selection by the killer, or an emphasised coincidence? Is Bible John one man, or were there multiple perpetrators? Could familial DNA finally unmask him, or has evidence simply degraded too much? We keep coming back to those questions because answers remain elusive.
One more thought on why there were no further Glasgow murders of the same pattern. Either the killer died, moved away, was imprisoned for an unrelated reason, or stopped. All are possibilities. If he moved and killed elsewhere, records would need to be matched across jurisdictions, often very hard in that era. If he died or committed suicide, we'd need to find corroborating evidence like a deathbed confession or persistent links in local archives. The absence of later similar murders is unsettling, but not decisive.
I want to bring this back for a moment to the human cost. These were women, Pat Docker, Jemima McDonald and Helen Puttock, all mothers, all part of communities. Their families lived with grief and with an uncertain sense of justice. The police, the media, the town, everyone tried to make meaning out of this horror, but meaning often took the form of myth, and myths can obscure rather than reveal the person who did this. So when we retell the case, we should keep the victims at the centre, not the nickname. That's a guiding principle for me.
Amen. The investigatory and forensic fascination can sometimes eclipse the victim's realities, lives interrupted, children left motherless, families who never had closure. The purpose of cold casework should be to restore agency to those victims through truth, if possible.
Ewan, given everything we know from the record, what do you think is the most plausible scenario? Who was Bible John?
If we stick strictly to the evidence presented, a man local to Glasgow, likely in his mid-20s to early 30s at the time, articulate and able to charm women in public settings, comfortable in dance halls, possibly with a religious upbringing and a punitive view of female sexuality. He may have had a job or role that gave him a confident public persona. The ID card episode in the taxi is suggestive. I think the strongest case is for a single offender with ritualistic elements, not for someone like Tobin, who was definitively excluded by DNA. But I can't point to a name the files have proved, so the most plausible answer, tragically, is an unknown local man, now almost certainly dead, unless familial DNA leads surface.
So many listeners ask whether modern genealogy techniques could finally crack this. Is that realistic, Ewan?
In theory, yes. If the semen profile yields enough usable DNA and investigators are willing and able to run it through genealogy databases, a close relative could be found, and then traditional police work could close the loop. But two things temper optimism: the quantity and quality of the DNA, and legal and ethical constraints on using commercial genealogy databases in Scotland and the UK. It's promising, but far from guaranteed.
One of the persistent tensions we talk about as journalists is the line between curiosity and exploitation. Cases like Bible John invite endless speculation, books, TV shows, cold case bloggers, and while some work is careful and respectful, other retellings veer into sensationalism. We have to be mindful of how we frame the story. The nickname is catchy, but names and real details matter more.
I agree. And for detectives, there's a parallel risk: confirmation bias. If you focus on one suspect that fits a narrative, you can inadvertently ignore other avenues. The McInnes case, exhumation, inconclusive DNA, may have seemed like progress to some and a dead end to others. Careful, methodical re-examination is the only way forward.
Listeners, we often close episodes with a set of questions for you to carry. Let me read a few. If the police had realised immediately that Patricia Docker had been at the Barrowland, do you think the second and third murders could have been prevented? How much weight should we give to Jean Langford's memory now, decades later? Does the menstrual pattern make it more likely that Bible John was someone with extreme religious sexual shame? Or could it be coincidence amplified by media? And finally, what does this case tell us about policing and gender in 1960s Glasgow?
Those are exactly the right questions. And to add one more, if a familial DNA lead points to a living relative, how should police balance the public interest in solving the case with privacy concerns of those relatives? There are deep ethical choices at the intersection of science and justice.
Before we end, Ewan, any closing thoughts on the legacy of the case?
It's a lesson in limits. Limits of technology at the time, limits of memory, and limits of the legal system in bringing closure. But it's also a reminder of the perseverance of investigators and families who refused to let the story vanish. The case shaped policing practices, forensic ambitions, and public discourse around violence against women, and it stands, still unanswered, as a call to continue doing the quiet, patient work that might one day name the man responsible.
For me, the case is also an invitation to remember the women as more than headlines. Pat, Jemima and Helen were daughters, mothers, neighbours. Their deaths changed families forever. If this episode does anything, I hope it nudges listeners to feel the human loss at the centre of a cold case, not just the puzzle. Thank you, Ewan. That was heavy.
It is heavy. Thanks for having me, Laura. And for any listeners who remember that time or who have information, police historically welcomed tips, and modern cold case units still do. Even small details can matter.
We'll include information in the episode notes about how to contact the relevant cold case teams. One last thing. The Barrowland still stands. People still go dancing there. The city keeps living alongside its shadows. That, perhaps, is the most poignant part of this story. Life carries on, even with questions that never fully close. Thank you for listening.
Bye for now. Take care.
This has been Still Unanswered. I'm Laura McKinnon. If you found this episode meaningful, please consider supporting the show. Good night.